However, Republicans, because they have the majority, have voted down all of those amendments. And it does give you this idea that with this trial, Republicans have a big advantage. And don't forget, it takes a two-thirds majority in the Senate to remove a president from office. Frankly, it's highly, highly unlikely that that is going to happen in this case. But this impeachment trial all plays into the next election, and you can imagine Democrats and Republicans are going to use this for political purposes as the days, I was going to say drag on, but perhaps it might get more exciting from here.
Well, let's wait and see. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Chris Buckler there. Diane, it started. An incredibly important day. But do you think for the American public, when they look at this, because it seems to be so much on partisan lines, they're going to be following it as closely as you've been following it?
No. I mean, I think, no, to be honest, look, we all know we're watching a soap opera. We know the end of this. So that's one of the things that is, I think, demoralizing for a lot of people here is we know that the parties are going to vote along party lines, ergo President Trump will get off. And this is about essentially, you know, setting the stage for the election. And so I think it's not gripping for most people. And frankly, today was mostly about the rules, as we've said. But it's, you know, you do step back and you think, had Richard Nixon basically laid these as the ground rules, that there's very much evidence he would have gotten away with Watergate. So it's a very different era. And I think for a lot of people, it's disheartening to watch what's going on.
What sort of impact? You mentioned there the elections. What sort of impact do you think the impeachment process is going to have on that election? Is it going to benefit Donald Trump, or is it going to benefit whoever that Democratic candidate's going to be?
I think polls are starting to show that even those who support Trump believe that he did something wrong in this case. Very few people. It's very difficult to buy into the idea that this is a hoax, a witch hunt, because we have, on this very narrow case, very clear evidence. And, you know, and frankly, more evidence has come forward since the Congress looked at this. So the goal is to get as much evidence out there for people to look at and make their own judgment, and to basically, to some extent, get senators on the record saying things that many of them would like to be silent on, which is basically standing up and be seen to support President Trump in light of this evidence. That's what the Democrats want. What the Republicans want, of course, and I'm just broad brush here because there are many who don't, they just want to sort of showcase this as you know, a false exercise to begin with, and one that's just going after President Trump because Democrats can't win an election on its own merits.
Simon, when you talk to people in Singapore, are they closely following it? Do they understand what's happening in terms of the impeachment process?
People are aware of it here. I mean, you look, Singapore is, like many countries in Southeast Asia, watching the ascendancy of China and trying to juggle China and American relations one up against the other. And, you know, it's disheartening to see so much bickering and disunity in the body politic in the U.S. Governments are elected to serve the people, not to fight each other. And to that extent, I think it's dismal that there's been such a disappointing breakdown in civility in the way that Congress operates. And, you know, that's been getting worse and worse from an outside perspective anyway over the last 20 years. And it's not good. It's not good because it helps China. It's not good because it creates dismay here and creates dismay, I guess, in the electorate in the U.S. probably. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in India, Simon, and I was chatting to some friends of mine there about the whole process, and they said, look, we don't understand it. What's the purpose of it when we know what's going to happen?
Yeah, well, Diane made some good points. I would question, though, Diane, your reading that this is going to hurt Trump. I think to the extent that Trump is an anti-establishment candidate, I think this will just confirm the views of much of his constituency that the establishment's ganging up on him. I think it'll help him, and I think there's every probability that he'll be re-elected again. So, you know, I share, you know, your Indian friends' dismay at this process, and worry that it's going to have exactly the opposite effect to what the Democrats are looking for, you know.
Diane?
I think he'll get reelected, but I think what this does do is it's showcasing to some extent how far the rot is, and I'm sounding very much like a capital D Democrat here. I'm not, but you know, the Senate, you know, we've seen this play out in other ways, both with regard to, blocking Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court. Now we have the Supreme Court. It's just very interesting to see it all come together today, where you have the Chief Justice sitting there. And I guess what, for me, it's a very emotional moment for me and for a lot of Americans, I think, because we're at a tipping point right now where people are wondering about the future of the democracy. That's not to say Trump won't get reelected. It's just to say that the process is so broken that I think it comes together when you see this kind of bickering, like Simon said.
There we go. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more from you over the course of the next few weeks on that. But let's get the news now from a very patient Danielle.
President Trump's impeachment trial has begun in the U.S. Senate, with Republicans and Democrats arguing over how it should proceed. A new government has been announced in Lebanon after 4 months of sometimes violent protests against corruption and mismanagement. A former chief executive of the mining company Vale has been charged with murder in Brazil over a dam collapse that killed more than 200 people. And health officials in the United States have announced the country's first case of a deadly coronavirus, which emerged in China.
Let's stay with that story now, because the number of people affected by the coronavirus in China is rising. More than 300 people have been infected so far, and 6 people have died. The virus, which was first reported in the Chinese city of Wuhan, home to 11 million people, has now spread to other areas of the country, with cases now being reported in many Chinese cities, including Beijing and Shanghai. Here's the reaction of some people in Beijing.
Because of the virus, we don't think it's safe to travel, so we've cancelled all our holidays. There are lots of people around us. They've also cancelled their trips because they're worried about the disease. I'm not worried. We're a little careful, but no more than that.
We're being kept informed of the situation. The government is giving information. It's transparent. We are not worried.
Meanwhile, U.S. officials say a traveller from China has been diagnosed with coronavirus after arriving in Seattle. Cases have also been reported in South Korea, Thailand and Japan. On Wednesday, the World Health Organization will hold an emergency meeting to decide whether to declare an international emergency. Dr. Lawrence Gostin is the director of the World Health Organization Center on National and Global Health Law.
We're facing a really significant problem. I mean, during SARS, China literally hid the SARS coronavirus from the world community for nearly 3 months. That didn't happen here. The Chinese authorities did report cases early. But what I really am concerned about is that the story keeps changing. So we're told to be reassured, cases contained, and then every day another case is found in another country. So now we have an escalating epidemic, and the whole world is at an alert, with the World Health Organization calling an emergency meeting.
You mentioned there that the virus is spreading. Many of our listeners will be sitting, getting a little worried, and asking a question is, how do you stop it moving from country to country? What are the screening procedures at airports, and do they work?
Well, during SARS and also during H1N1 influenza, countries around the world put up screening. They would also occur during Ebola epidemics in Africa. They were shown uniformly not to work. What we should be able to do now is genetically sequence the virus, which China has done and has shared. But Chinese surveillance and case investigations seem to be wanting. And so you've got a situation where China doesn't have a good understanding of who has the virus, who are the contacts, where are the contacts, and to have a method in place to find them and prevent them from traveling.
This is going to have then a huge economic impact on China. The SARS virus had an economic impact, but now with the scale of the Chinese economy and its importance to the global economy, this could be much bigger.
It could be much bigger. I mean, SARS at one point was thought to be devastating the Chinese economy, and it also really hurt other places in Asia like Singapore and also Canada in Ontario. In fact, it was thought to be almost catastrophic in China before they brought SARS under control. We don't know what the impact is going to be here, whether other countries will have trade bans because this is an animal vector, whether we'll have travel restrictions, whether there will be advisories against tourism. So the Chinese economy is certainly at risk if it doesn't quickly bring this under control. And I think the authorities realize that this is quite serious and they need to bring it under control.
In 2003, China seemed to struggle with the SARS virus. It seems to be struggling with this virus in 2020.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think, China has changed a lot since SARS. It learned a very hard lesson because it affected greatly the reputation, the international reputation of the country. Since that time, China has reformed, but there's still been examples where China hasn't fully shared viral samples. In this case, China's identified the virus very quickly, but has not been putting out information that I think we can all find transparent and trustworthy. But WHO is taking this very seriously. It has a good cooperative relationship with China, I hope. And I'm confident that if we really put in the resources, that we have the technology and the human power to actually bring it under control. This is not the time to panic. It's the time for careful, reflective case finding and isolating cases.
Dr. Lawrence Gostin there. Simon, he said not the time to panic, but he wasn't.
Well,
he wasn't. He didn't seem very confident that China can deal with this. Do you share that?
Having given us every reason to panic, he then said this wasn't the time to panic. Look, I detect a distinctly anti-Chinese tone in much of what I'm hearing in the media. Here's the reality of SARS, okay? We just heard it was a catastrophe for the Chinese economy. Rubbish, okay? How many people were killed by SARS? According to the World Health Organization's own data, it was 774. That's less people than die of ordinary flu every day across Asia. 3 million people die of of malaria annually in sub-Saharan Africa. It's interesting to me that I'm trying to be neutral here because it's just very easy to get partisan in these issues. I was in Asia during SARS, and in fact I knew people who suffered from it, and it's absolutely awful. But the casualties were relatively small in number, and when I read that CNN started calling this Wuhan flu and is now calling it Wuhan China syndrome, just in case people don't know that Wuhan isn't in Alberta or South America or somewhere, I start to really wonder about where we're going with this. We're creating an awful lot of drama. When I was here before, during SARS, a lot of corporations told their employees, not to travel anywhere, to stay at home and so on and so forth. Like many people, having lived here a long time, I simply disregarded that and carried on as most people do. So, forgive me, I'm very sympathetic to anyone who gets this. It's awful, but the fact of the matter is it's a storm in a teacup. It is not a cause for major panic, and it's certainly not going to crash the Chinese economy. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Dan, you were in Hong Kong during SARS. Do you agree with that analysis of what Simon said?
No, I don't. And also, I think from an actual casualty point of view, we've been very lucky. But I think the economic impact was up to $100 billion for SARS when you look at the global impact and things like canceled trips. But no, I was there. I think it was '97 basically, and it was a toddler. I remember it was a toddler that got this bird flu, and essentially they killed every duck and chicken on the entire island of Hong Kong and beyond. And I think that just to sort of understand the impact that had was, to some extent, it just gave us pause to recognize that they had to take such drastic measures out of fear. There were very few casualties, and fewer in this case. And I think that it just made me think about how we've been so lucky, not just this generation, but previous generations. You have to go back to World War I until you truly see what a global pandemic looks like. We've yet to experience that because we've kept these things relatively contained, but that's through communication, and that's through the kind of reaction that maybe seems like a storm in a teacup or tempest in a teacup. I think we have to take these things seriously, because if we have no cure, it spreads very quickly. It can kill a lot of people.
Simon, in Singapore at the moment, you said it's the Chinese New Year, a period of travel. Our people are worried.
I think people are pragmatic, because those who are in the international business community, like myself, have seen a lot of these. And every time this happens, the World Health Organization uses very extreme language, gets hold of a lot of money and gets a lot of vaccinations done, which suits which obviously suits the pharmaceutical industry. But the reality is, it's a circular discussion. You can't create alarm through the kind of language that we're hearing from the World Health Organization and then say, look, this has done enormous economic damage to China because nobody's traveling. Well, of course they're not traveling. You're telling them that there's a massive international catastrophe. There isn't. Yes?
But that does cause economic problems, doesn't it, Diane?
Well, I think more responsible reporting might to some extent mitigate that, yeah?
I think the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, the Chinese government, it is a balancing act, and especially Chinese New Year. I mean, this is, of course, the biggest travel season of the year for the Chinese and, for Asia, I'm sure, in general. And one of the things is you don't want to be putting the brakes on the economy at the same time. It's such an opportune moment for people to be spreading these viruses for which we have no cure. And that's the issue, is when you start getting into these bird viruses, these new types of, avian flus that mix with swine virus. I mean, we just don't know, and it takes a while to respond. So,
well, there we go.
Safe.
There we go. Two very differing views on a topic that's going to stay in the news for some time, but both eloquently put forward their different points. That, at the moment, for this part of the program, is it for Business Matters, but we shall be back very, very shortly. In fact, probably in a few seconds' time.